Welcome to the Martin Bailey Photography Podcast. It's December 22, 2014, and this is episode 453. A couple of weeks ago, I picked up the new Canon EOS 7D Mark II, and last week used it to shoot 3 days with the adorable snow monkeys in Nagano, 4 hours northwest of Tokyo, and I'm now in a position to talk about my first impressions. I'll follow up with a more detailed review later, but here are my initial thoughts on this new camera. Before we jump in and look at some photographs, let's talk a little about the camera itself. Probably one of the most important aspects for many is that the Canon EOS 7D Mark II is a crop factor camera. I've been shooting with full frame bodies since the first generation 5D and the 1DS. And although my old 1D Mark IV that I used to use for wildlife had a 1.3 times crop factor, since the release of the Canon EOS 1DX, I have been shooting exclusively with full-frame cameras. The 7D Mark II has a 1.6 times crop factor, which means that if you're shooting at 100mm focal length, the camera actually captures an image that is the equivalent of 160mm focal length. Now, for wide-angle shots, this is obviously an unwelcome limitation, but my main use for this camera is going to be wildlife, and similarly for sports photographers too. Getting a little bit more reach out of our telephoto lenses is generally a good thing. I'll try to go into more detail on all the new stuff when I have more images to share and more experience with the 7D Mark II, but for now, here are a few of the things that I'm very happy to see in this new body. Firstly, I was really pleasantly surprised to see that the viewfinder on the 7D Mark II is approximately 100%. The original 7D also has 100% viewfinder, although I never used the original 7D. My old crop factor cameras though had very dark viewfinders, which I never really liked. You don't necessarily notice this if it's all you shoot with, but once you start shooting with 100% viewfinder, the narrower field of view models seem dark and really difficult to see well. I also really like some of the new features in the intelligent viewfinder too, such as the ability to turn on a permanent digital level that displays whenever you half press the shutter button. On my other bodies, I have to map the multifunction button to display this level whenever I press the button, and I was stumped initially that I couldn't map this button in the custom functions on the 7D Mark II. But then I found how to turn this on in the viewfinder, and I love that it's there all the time now as I shoot. Here's a screenshot from the user's manual to show you what I mean. The digital level is at the top of the frame, above the focusing points, which means that you can now simply glance at it whenever you need to ensure that you have the camera level, rather than pressing a button to display this information using the focus points, as is the case with the 5D Mark III and the 1DX that I also use. You can also now display various camera settings in the intelligent viewfinder, such as your autofocus mode, which I love being able to do. I switch between one shot and AI servo quite a lot, and being able to see that information right there in the viewfinder is very useful. I've also turned on displaying my image quality in the viewfinder as well. I only ever shoot RAW, but I've found myself in JPEG through reasons that I could never understand in the past, and have had to reshoot images in RAW, so I just like to be able to see this in the viewfinder as a double check. The other major change, and probably the reason that I decided to buy the 7D Mark II, is that it has an almighty 65 focus points, all cross-type. The 5D Mark III and the 1DX have a very respectable 61 focus points, but even the 1DX, with its incredible autofocusing only has 41 cross-type sensors. Does this mean that the 7D Mark II has better autofocus? Well, unfortunately it doesn't really, as we'll see. Another feature that sports and wildlife shooters are always interested in is the number of frames per second, and the 7D Mark II shoots a very respectable 10 frames per second. This is the same as the 1D Mark IV, which was the top of the line sports camera from Canon before the 1DX, and even the 1DX only beats that by 2 frames per second in RAW mode. So again, 10 frames per second for a $1,800 camera is just crazy talk. Amazing. As an aside, the shutter sound of the 7D Mark II is pretty sweet too. Not very loud, but a nice solid sound that's very easy on the ears. I've got it next to me, so I'm just going to rip off a few frames here so that you can tell. I also really like how GPS is now built in, which saves me from having to use my GPE2, which I'm still using on the 5D Mark III and the 1DX to geotag my images. In the 7D Mark II settings, you can set the camera to either just tag images or to create a track log and tag the images at the same time. One thing that I don't like is that the camera continues to record coordinates even after you turn it off. This means that you have to go into the menus and disable GPS when you no longer need the track log to be created. In my opinion, this should turn off when the camera is turned off, or at least have an option for it to be turned off with the camera, which would save you going into the menus each time. With regards to weatherproofing, at first I thought that this might be a bit of clever marketing blurb, as it was with the 5D Mark III, but Canon claim that the 7D Mark II has enhanced dust and weather resistance, and go on to state in the camera specifications that the camera's seals are built to resist water and dust, which, in addition to the rigid magnesium alloy body, makes the 7D Mark II ready for almost anything. Now, I'm still not going to take this at face value until I've really given the weatherproofing a good hammering, but we had a fair amount of rain on one afternoon with the snow monkeys, and it snowed for most of the rest of the time, and the camera held up fine so far, without any kind of protection. Now, of course, snow isn't wet until it melts, so not such a great test, but the rain didn't bother it at all in the few hours that I got mine wet. More to come on this later as I really put the camera through its paces. I also want to give an honourable mention to the built-in intervalometer and bulb timer, which has been a long time coming, and I love this, but it's totally wasted for me on this camera because I will almost certainly never use this feature on my wildlife camera. This is something that I would have loved on the 5D Mark III and will be happy to hopefully see in a future full-frame camera, which is what I'll use for my landscape work. Okay, so they're the main features that I'm impressed with and that led me to pick up my own 7D Mark II. But how did the camera handle in the field? As I said, I used the 7D Mark II for 3 full days shooting the snow monkeys with some private tour customers that I took over to Jigokudani for 4 days last week. I shot all of the images that we'll look at today with the Canon EF 70-200 f2.8 Mark II lens without an extender fitted. I'll update you on these findings after I've taken this camera to Hokkaido with me to photograph the red-crowned cranes and whooper swans and sea eagles for a total of almost 4 weeks in January and February. But my initial impressions based on photographing the snow monkeys are as follows. First of all, if you want the ultimate sports and wildlife camera, the 1DX is still it, for a number of very subtle reasons, but when you consider that the 7D Mark II is almost a quarter of the price, the reasons can become a little bit insignificant. One of the reasons is that there's a very slight lag when you first raise the camera to your eye to capture something in a hurry. A number of times I'd see a snow monkey doing something that I wanted to capture in an instant, but the camera takes just a split second or maybe around half a second or so to respond when you try to focus initially. Now, this could be down to the Intelligent Tracking and Recognition, or ITR autofocus, which the manual says can slow down the focusing a little. I prefer to leave ITR AF turned on though, because it uses subject color information to continue to focus on the subject, which is pretty important when tracking a subject around the frame. It's also very possible, if not likely, that the lag that I was seeing was due to the cold weather, which slows down the liquid crystal action, and that is used to display the in-screen information, perhaps giving the impression that the camera itself is slow. The temperature was between 1 degree Celsius to around -8 during our time with the snow monkeys, which is certainly cold enough to start seeing this behavior. So, is this slight lag a big problem? Not really. I can totally live with it, especially when you consider the cost compared to the 1DX. We aren't really comparing apples to apples by expecting it to be quite as snappy. I'll let you know how the camera fares in really cold conditions once I've used it in Hokkaido though, but I don't think that this is going to be a big issue. Plus, Canon only actually support the camera down to freezing point, 0 Celsius, which is ridiculous when you consider how these cameras are used, but that's their decision to make, I guess. The other thing that wildlife and sports shooters are going to be interested in hearing about is the AI servo focusing performance. Once again, so far this doesn't seem as accurate as the 1DX. Let's look at a series of 30 frames of a snow monkey coming straight towards the camera. This burst was literally 3 seconds long, so I didn't stop shooting at all between these 30 frames. The very first frame was totally sharp, so the camera had no problem locking onto the face of the snow monkey quickly as I raised the camera. Note that in the settings I have the camera set up to give priority to focus for the first AI servo image, so this is as I expected. I also have the AI servo second image priority set to focus rather than speed, so I was expecting the following images to be perhaps more consistently sharper, but that wasn't really the case. The camera kept sharp focus until frame 5, when it ran off a little for a total of 5 frames, before locking back onto the face in frame 10, the last image in the top row in this series that I'm showing you here. After that, frames 11 through 17 were also slightly soft, with the focus just slightly behind the face. Frame 18 was sharp again, and then the focus ran off very slightly again for 5 frames, getting gradually worse, until the focus almost locked back in on frame 24, and it got really sharp again by frame 26. Unfortunately, by that time the snow monkey's foot was starting to leave the frame at the bottom. The last 2 frames were totally soft as the monkey dropped out of the frame. I'm checking sharpness at 100% as I always do because I want the maximum sharpness, and honestly I think the performance was under par, and I found this to be continuously the case for around 8 similar bursts. The sharpness comes in for some frames, but then runs out again, and you don't really see that level of failure with the 1DX with the same tracking and sensitivity settings. Don't get me wrong, if you aren't worried about critical sharpness, many of these images are usable, but they aren't totally sharp. Here's a 100% crop from frame 18, which is probably the sharpest of the series, so that you can see how sharp it got. I'd use this at a push, although I'm not totally happy with it. The settings for this series, by the way, was 800th of a second at f8 ISO 640. Here too are frames 19, 20 and 21, which gradually run more and more out of focus from left to right. Don't forget to click on the image on the blog so that you can open it up to see the detail, and make sure that your browser is wide, because these are like 1920 pixels wide, things like that. So try to take a look, and don't forget, if you are only listening to the audio, then the blog post is at mbp.ac/453. You'll really need to click on the image and take a look at it full size to see the detail, or lack of it in this case. This example is about a 66% crop of the original, so it's downsized very slightly to enable me to show you all three images together like this. Frame 19 is still just about usable at a push, but frames 20 and 21 are unusable really. Now, in a burst like this, I'm happy if I have some usable frames, so this is not necessarily a bad result, but it's not as good as I'd expected either. So these results probably are not what many of you were hoping to see or hear about, but this is the reality. Do bear in mind that even when using the 1DX, we aren't necessarily going to nail every frame, but the hit ratio is usually a little bit higher than this in similar conditions. As I say though, this is from just over a handful of bursts, and I'll be giving the 7D Mark II another good test in January and February on my winter tours and workshops, and I will be sure to report my findings in March when I get back. My autofocus settings here, by the way, were tracking sensitivity set to 0, so equal priority for locked on and responsiveness. Acceleration, deceleration tracking was set to 1, which should help to track a subject moving at various speeds, and AF point auto switching was set to 0, as I usually prefer the autofocus to stick with my subject rather than moving to the surrounding object. Okay, so before we finish this first impressions review, let's take a quick look at the ISO performance. I shot between ISO 640 and 1600 over the 3 days and was pretty impressed with the ISO performance, to say that there are 20.2 megapixels on the 7D Mark II's APS-C sensor. I'll need to do some straight comparisons to really compare the 7D Mark II and the 5D Mark III and the 1DX, but from what I've seen up to ISO 1600, the 7D seems to be pretty much on par with the 5D Mark III. Here's a 100% crop from an image shot at ISO 1600 at 125th of a second at f8. Again, you'll need to click on the image to view it full size, as the image that's embedded right there in the blog is downsized slightly. But once you view the full-sized image, you can see that there's a little bit of visible grain creeping in, but it's very organic and nothing that I'll worry about when I have to start to increase my ISO in low light. I'll do some direct comparisons later, but for now, all I can say is that I'm pretty happy with the ISO performance of the 7D Mark II. Here too is the image that I cropped this last example from, just in case you were wondering what this little guy looks like in context. And here to finish with is another shot of a little monkey, just because. Because you've got to love these little guys. This was shot at ISO 800, 400th of a second at f5.6. So after that, you're probably wondering now how happy I am with the 7D Mark II. Well, at this point in time, despite the new 65 cross-type focus points, I'm happy enough but not overly impressed with the autofocus. I'll know more about this soon, but for now, it's good but not amazing. ISO performance is good, especially considering the 20.2 megapixels resolution, and there are a bunch of other features that I mentioned that are very welcome too. All in all, it's a big thumbs up, And when you consider that I'm basing most of my comparisons with the Canon EOS 1DX, which is almost 4 times the price, you really can't go wrong with the 7D Mark II. As a cheaper alternative to the top of the line, you'll get what you pay for and much, much more. I've actually just picked up the new 100-400 Mark II lens as well on December 19, 2014. And that was the day after my visit to the Snow Monkeys. I'll be taking the 100-400 on the road again in January and February, and will be reporting my findings on that in March as well, along with the 7D Mark II review update. If you don't usually follow my blog, do bookmark it or subscribe to the RSS feed or subscribe to the podcast in iTunes so that you don't miss these upcoming reviews, along with all of the other photography goodness that I publish. As it's Christmas in just 3 days, for those of you that are listening hot off the press, a very Merry Christmas to you all. Thanks for listening through the year, and I hope that we'll be seeing you again in the new year. I will be releasing one more episode this year before we wrap it up, but Merry Christmas to you all. So thanks for listening today. If you enjoy this podcast, please do share a link with your friends. And if you don't already, please subscribe in iTunes or your favorite podcast program to ensure uninterrupted delivery. You can find me on Google+, Twitter and Facebook, etc., and links to everything that I'm up to are at the top page at martinbaileyphotography.com. So do drop by and take a look. I'll be back next week with that last episode of 2014. But in the meantime, you take care and have a great week, whatever you're doing. Bye-bye.